Hello, this is Joachim Stroh, and I am your host for another session on the social ledger, the next generation social ledger. So today's topic is probably circling back to our last time we talked about the architecture and the different sort of platforms we are going to use to build this thing. Because one of the next steps, as I can see it, is we need to decide on the platform, right? Is it something like a framework, or is it more like an open component thing? And then we want to drill down on more of the detailed specs, right? So my thinking is really, go from a high-level conceptual framework towards the development environment, and then towards what are we actually implementing here, right? So what are actually the feature sets we're targeting? And again, to me, this is in the context of there's a minimal viable product we want to push out there. A product that's so minimal that it can't be used, but by sort of volunteers, our circle here, to see, hey, there's something that's starting to take shape, and we may be able to even use it to build the social ledger itself. So that becomes part of the development process, right? So what we're putting together here and the feedback we are receiving, also, not only among us, but by circling this thing out to a wider group, then helps us create that thing. So that's my thinking on today's session. Anybody has other ideas? Gary, Michael, John?
Well, my thought is I'm starting to see now the prototypical nature of the social ledger that we now have, and I guess my thinking and questions I've been having are. How much further do we want to go with a minimum viable product in a less than optimal selection of development tools? I mean, again, I'm not qualified to even evaluate or use these tools, but I do see we're making a change in our platform, in our architecture, if we go with something like web components. And how are we losing some sort of advantage by making a shift like this that we have by being the first in this space?
Yes, thanks, Gary. That's a great question, and something I want to talk to you guys today. Hopefully John comes back. He might be dropped off here for some performance bandwidth reasons.
I think he's still on.
Still on? I don't see him on my screen here. Do you see him as a...
Sorry, I've lost track. Carry on.
Okay. All right. Hey, Jim, welcome back. You are the man. Tell us more. Give us a quick update on the ArchN Governance Conference. We've seen you running around the screen there all the time, talking to so many people there. It must have been quite exciting.
Well, there's so much. It's really hard to nail it. I think there's some angst on my part about the current direction of the ArchN development, but I'm not really in a position to judge. And in the meantime, I haven't checked out the web components alternative. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about it before John comes back.
Right. Yeah, that was a big topic last time. So we gave John the microphone, and he stepped us through a couple of slides. Let me make sure he shares these slides on our channel there, and we recorded the presentation too. So, you know, whenever you have time again, Jim, take a look at the last recording, because that's really, John stepping us through the pros and cons of comparing a web framework with web components, right? So it's really two sides of the of a way of creating interactive applications. So, as a summary of this, that made me step back and say, hey, maybe we do not need to run a full stack web framework like Meteor. And we may be able to use more of an open framework that delivers on all the pieces, right? It's one of the things that came out of this conversation was he gave us a quick demo on some of the capabilities. It's essentially, almost, at par with what Meteor can provide, right? In terms of the reactivity and in terms of embedding a UI component and then attaching some data channels to UI elements, right? So you click some button and it immediately updates something on the screen. The same thing, we saw with the Meteor framework. So his notion was, yes, we can be at par fairly quickly, and the code doesn't get too convoluted. From the demo that he shared with us, it's still readable. It's not as clean as Meteor, I would say, because obviously they've reduced it to a bare minimum, and the platform takes care of so many other things underneath. But from what I've seen there, it's may not even be necessary, right? So if we can deliver that kind of functionality within a web component framework, where we build sort of future-proof into the browser, right? So sort of relying on the browser vendors, actually, they'll be able to support that, and they already, what we've seen there in terms of the components, the polyfill stuff that was happening in the last year or so, it's incredible. I mean, they've fulfilled, all of the promises. They've really built the stuff, and polyfill is at a stage where they have to look for new stuff now, right? So Google and Polymer just have to come up with new things that they push the browser vendors to come up with. I was still a bit concerned about, Google playing a large role here in this emerging picture, but so are the other browser vendors, right? So if we get to a conclusion here, and that's why I want you, Jim, to take a look at, take your time, take a look at John's presentation, and maybe ping him, and we have another conversation with him on this later, if you can come back today. That we do want to make a decision between using web components only, not Meteor or not any other, framework out there, and see if we can build this on more open technologies that's more future-proof. I don't know. What's your initial reaction to that, Jim? Are you more familiar with this territory? I'm not so much, but maybe you are.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly read about it, and the things I've heard, it sounds like a no-brainer. It sounds like we get a lot more flexibility going with the web components. Is that your take on it?
Yeah, that's one of the key messages I have to say was, and that struck me really. That was a wake-up call for me, is the engineering is in a way that you don't like a component, well, you rip it out and replace it with something better, right? You can do that because it's an open stack, right? This is different than Meteor. If you don't like something with Meteor, well, you have to wait until they come up with a better release for it, right? So it's more tied to that kind of platform. But going back to Gary's earlier point here, which to me is also very important, which is they give you kind of a quick push to come up with a prototype fairly quickly. Just looking at the different code examples that are fairly close to what we want to build with the social ledger, that made me think that, well, yeah, we can get to a point where fairly quickly can have something up and running there, a prototype really, right? And that's functional. And it's embedded, because of the DPP, the data protocol they have with the Mongo database, and the nice integration, both replicating the data sets from the server to the client, and then you can use the Mongo data right in the client. It's a very fast, efficient way to, show this reactive piece, on the interface. So I still like that a lot about Meteor. And also where Meteor is going in terms of GraphQL, right? So they have this new piece called Apollo, which is their way of embedding GraphQL into their world. Again, it's their stack that they're building up there. And GraphQL to me is, as far as I can understand it at this point, is a great way to tap into the API infrastructure, right? The APIs of all the different open source applications we want to eventually bring into this ecosystem of social ledger applications, right? If they have a good way of integrating that, will take off a lot of our load to say, hey, we don't need to do this each and every one differently and figure out what the API is. Maybe there's a more standardized way by using GraphQL to tap into the APIs and just load the damn data into our database, or the GraphQL buffer thing that they provide, and then we can directly use it on our interface, right? That'd be a very elegant solution. But, Jim, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm 100% behind using, GraphQL. I mean, it corresponds well to actually putting it on our chain, or moving on to our chain. So I wanted to, for a long time I was looking toward using GraphQL, and I'm glad you latched onto it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting piece of technology, and it seems like slowly emerging as a standard there, right? For more and more applications that say we're going to do less of the direct, URL-based access to the data sets, and then move towards more. That's a bit more. It's not only the polling stuff. You constantly have to poll and query and send requests to these backend databases, so the API calls. But this seems to me a way to say, hey, anything changes on that database on their end, tell us about it, right? And then we can refresh our data sets. It's a much more efficient protocol between our application and their data sets.
And is that Meteor dependent, Joachim, or?
No, that's the cool thing. Again, it's not actually Meteor dependent. So what I would hope is the whole GraphQL thing becomes just another engineering piece in the web components side.
Sounds like a good fix on that. I think one of the points that John was talking explicitly to was what he calls technological debt, that you can get into a place, Jim, for your benefit on this, you get into a place where your development is quite buried in one silo, one technology, one stack. And he felt that there was a greater opportunity for other people to come to the project if it was at the web app level rather than in Meteor. So it's not so much about the emergence of the prototype. Maybe Meteor is a much better quick fix, do it process there. It was more about then where do you go in 3 months, 6 months time? And how accessible is it to the wider hacking world?
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah. So the plan, Jim, is I'm at this point I'm indifferent to either one, right? But I want you to weigh in and then see what you think about John's points, right? And if you have some time, look at web components itself and see if you're comfortable with that kind of technology, right? Or if you feel like, or if you know something that it may not be the way to go, or some too big issues on the horizon, let us know, And then I think I'm thinking, depending on your schedule, Jim, this week or next week, we can make a decision on what approach are we going to take for the development environment, right? Muted. You need a button thingy in your hand or something, You could push it.
Yeah, should do something. I expect I'm going to love it, and I will do my research. But I think the web methods approach seems like they've already figured out, how to make it flexible and let it evolve, make an evolutionary system that is more inclusive rather than exclusive.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, Gary.
John's introduction was, I feel, an excellent one to watch, Jim. I went and did some more research on it, and I'm really impressed by his introduction to the whole plane or playing field.
Yep. He has a lot of knowledge and seems to have done a lot of research in figuring out the pros and cons. So
I need the link.
Yeah. The link to you can see the conversation is uploaded, so you can just look it up in the Social Ledger Lab. But let me ask him for a link to the deck. Although the deck is not, that shows you some of the basic points he's making. But the demo at the end was more interesting, I thought, to see actually that some of the pieces already working in the demo he put together.
Awesome.
So if we go with the web components route, what that means for us, we need to agree on some of the components we're actually going to use, right? Because now it's more, free form. It's not stacked and defined. So we as a, developer collective here need to say, okay, these are the components we're going to use or going to build, right? So I think the burden is a bit on our side to say, hey, what actually the pieces that we agree on, so that if other developers come on board, they align with that platform, right? Otherwise, we'll go into way too many directions, and it's hard to join and onboard this project. So I want to keep that as simple as possible. But I do like the approach, and I do like, one of his demos also, he was using Go as a language as a server-based thing that sends some data to the front end. So there's even more flexibility to say in terms of the different languages you want to use for the social ledger. I could see that happening too. Could be JavaScript as a baseline, but then beyond that, there could be other languages involved too, which is very promising. Okay.
Yeah, on the R-Chain side, we're leaning more towards Scala.js and ultimately Rust with WebAssembly. But it's amazing what people do with Go. People should, the architecture of the system should be so that people can program in whatever they want to program in. Everything is APIs. You know what? It's a bot ecosystem, right?
Right. So let's talk about sort of where are we taking the social ledger next. I've shown it to my folks at the Change Agents Worldwide community, and they keep coming back with very positive feedback. I haven't seen any critical remark there. They all love what they see, and can't wait to get this started. They're coming from an organizational design perspective, right? So it's people like Harold Jarkey, John Husband, Eilert Baron, who have been working in these organizational design fields for decades, right? And they love what they see, and they love the combination of that. Suddenly, there's a ledger underneath that's blockchain based, and there's an attachment of activities and actions in the social space that is now being we can record that in a ledger. So that's very promising. Same with John Kelton and folks. So he's already starting to think, how can we help out? How can we go further with this? Because it fits pretty well into his model, his mode of thinking of what he's been doing for decades now with the conversation community, right? He's planning to do, sort of tapping into the wisdom of the conversation community. That's his stuff on Facebook and Google Plus. sort of extracting some of these patterns. He's the guy who's really into patterns that come out of these conversations, and then how do you map these patterns to then actionable insights? That's what he calls it, actionable insights. And to me, something like the social ledger would really support this view of how do you get the patterns, and in that case, tapping into some APIs of different data streams, be that a conversation community in Facebook. I mean, Facebook has an API, right? Or other tools you're using within the team, and extract that, put some logic into this field, and then create a UI that everybody can, is obvious to use, right? So something like card pasting that you can manipulate. It's very tangible. It's an interface that's creating a lot of affordances, right? So you can see the card, you can see a button, you can see a menu there, you can click on that, you can find out what's happening next. So that to me is very promising. So I haven't heard anything negative. And the notion is really, how do we move forward with this? So my thinking, Jim, yeah.
There's actually a lot from the Archain Governance Conference that I hope I need to get you involved with. Ian, what's his name? Who was a speaker at one point. I don't know if you saw the thing on System 1, System 2, System 3, System 5. But it's a model of rather than modeling the organization, they're sort of modeling the communications. I can't do it justice right now, but I think it seemed to be that that could be merged with the social ledger. It's like it gives it another dimension.
Yes, that's true. There's a guy, John Kelden loves to talk about conversations, right? And there's a couple of members in his conversation community, including this woman, Liz Werner. She's from Technical University Berlin. That was my alma mater too. I went to that school too, and I met her in New York actually. And she has a good relationship with Paul Pangaro, and he is the person who talked about communications theory. Unbelievable stuff he had put together. So Paul Pangaro has these graphs and models. How do you theorize on two parties, multiple parties communicating, and how these messages flow back and forth. This is very much cybernetics here, right? So the feedback loops you created, and then the larger feedback loops, I think that you just were talking about, Jim, in that kind of conversation theory. Fascinating stuff, and John keeps talking about that too. And certainly I want to bring some of these aspects into the next generation social ledger here.
Yeah, at the top you have identity and purpose, and then you have where we're going, what we're changing, the future, and then we have what we're doing today, and how there's conflicts between the levels. Very interesting, but it's and I follow John a little bit on Facebook, and I guess I've read some stuff. I mean, it's great stuff.
Yep. Yeah.
One of the things that came from one of those conversations was that I brought with me to the forum, and I think it resonated with a lot of people, was there's two reasons that you make a decision. One is out of fear, the other is out of love. And then he goes into how the love decisions basically you make the organization, drive the organization up, whereas the fear ones drive it down. Pretty cool.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I saw some of the things on the videos. You could tell, if somebody was talking in front and they were able to record that. I love it's a much softer approach. And I see this across the board, all these decentralized collectives, permaculture groups, living systems groups, they all take a very soft approach to this, which I really like. It's really, that's the missing piece to me that the others had. The opposite happens for such a long time, right? It's all about performance efficiency and data, cold data, right? And then here come the decentralized guys who want to tackle that in an entirely different way, right? And I saw was Greg's mother was there too. She was leading some of this stuff.
Yes. And there was, that basically split the room. It's people that were into, or, more tolerant of it, and they benefited from it, and those that rejected it totally.
Interesting.
But it seems like a lot of the programmers rejected it.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of is new territory, right? And unfamiliar territory, right? And they don't see really the connection at this point. But a lot has to do with John Calvin talking about social presence and social cognition. The recognition, the awareness of other people in the room, the relationship and the resonance you build between them is so important. That to me is this one diagram I had with the interaction piece versus the transaction piece. So the transaction being the code, cache, hard data, exchange of data, so proof of that you've done this thing. And then the interaction piece is the human side, right? It's the people, it's the interaction, it's the trusted space versus the trustless environment for making that code transaction, right? So the trusted space is, to me, like the other side of the coin here, right? You can't, they don't come in isolation, right? They don't live by themselves. So there's a transaction piece, yeah, but there's a very strong human component too. And seeing people at the conference, emphasizing that human component, I think, is an important aspect. Right. Let me show you. I want to show you a few slides here for our viewers out there. I want to make this a little bit more interesting. Show them some pictures here of what we've done recently. Let me share my screen. Oh yeah. So here's a slide. Do you see the slide?
Yeah.
Good. So I talked about the human side of things, right? So the cognition, the what I call the new cognition. That's towards the end here when we talk about new bridges and then new economics. That's the thing with interactions and transactions, the two sides of the coin, same coin. So I added another one called new cognition, right? And this is a simple 2x2 here. If you look at this, there's me and there's we, right? So you can look at this from me, myself, individually, versus we as a group, as a larger collective, right? And then on the bottom, you see there's internal stuff, there's external stuff. So all of the stuff you express outwards, that other people can interact with, the external, and then the internal is what's going on inside your brain, or what's the unseen stuff among people, right? So that to me is a very interesting graph or matrix that's coming from solid research from a person called Hanne de Jager. And you can see at the bottom here, there are a couple of links here to research papers of what Hanne did over the years. And what she says basically is, you look at this we component here, and you tap into something called the collective consciousness, and she calls that intersubjectivity. So the thing that happens between people if they're in the same room, right? So the resonances you see, you feel among the people. And that to me is a very important component to that. And I don't know if you're familiar with the British composer. His name is Brian Eno. He coined the term Senius. Senius is like the action that happens out of a setting of people, coming together and doing something together. There's suddenly this notion of, hey, there's energy in the room, right? There's something happening. And he coined the term Senius. That's actually the name of the company. We found it later as Senius, based on that expression of Senius. And later we found out there's actually a whole bunch of research, academic research being done on the notion of intersubjectivity. It's called enactive intersubjectivity. That's the term that's coming from the academic world. And enaction is this other piece here on the bottom. So this is you. I think you heard this a lot at the forum, Jim. It's the embodiment of yourself putting out there and enacting things, right? So the external view of you, who you are, how do you interact, with other people here. And then, of course, the top right here, the we and the external, the social interaction. Right? So academic term, interobjectivity here. But to me, this is more like, okay, now we're together, now we're talking, now we're beginning to have some interactions here, and we want to record some of these interactions and provide some affordances and hints, into that new space here to say, hey, what can we do together to move our task, our project forward, right? So this is the whole notion of this social interaction space. So take a look at this. It's interesting research stuff, and we try to actually apply some of this in the knowledge expeditions that we were running. So to find some hints what they were talking about, well actually the expeditions we ran surfaced some of the things they were talking about. It was just the other way around, right? So we came back and found that research stuff later, and then that confirmed a lot of the strange things that happened in these expedition spaces. So it's pretty cool stuff, and great to have some academic, backdrop here into the social side, the human side of the social ledger. That's one piece. The other thing, Jim, that's something, I just took that out of the links I found around Vlad Zamfir, right? I believe he was at the conference too. I haven't seen a video yet where he was talking. I was looking for that. I don't know if anything was recorded, or was he talking at the conference?
Yeah, he sort of gave. I thought he sort of gave a keynote type.
Oh, he did give a keynote?
Remember, I certainly heard him talking a lot. I don't know what was recorded exactly.
Okay.
But, yeah.
So see if you can find anything. I'd love to hear more from this guy. And he wrote a couple of articles on Medium that I read. And one of the recent ones is, and that's why I'm thinking this is very relevant to what we're doing here. So his thinking sort of shifted. It's all on the topic of governance, right? So how do you govern a large body of people in an economic context, right? And what he came from is everybody defines governance in a more competitive economic context, right? And then recently, I think he shifted his thinking and says, okay, what if we define governance not in a competitive environment, but rather in one that's oligopolistic and more, and he calls it, a shift from ordinary independent game theory, right, where you have winners and losers, and someone gets the big bonus, towards a social choice / cooperative game theory. Okay, so the idea, and that blew my mind here, right? The idea of saying, hey, why don't we look at governance in a cooperative setting, right? So where the goals are entirely different than in a competitive setting, and see what resonance or what governance means in this kind of context, right? So that's the stuff I want to explore here with the social ledger tool, because to me, this meta body that we're defining here, right, where groups join the social ledger, they can create their own spaces, right? And they can come, from the earlier slide, right? You can see they can come from one organizational silo, right, where they are confined and starting to open up and see, hey, what's that thing called open participatory organization or human organization, right? Let me join this. Let me create our space for our organization, in the social ledger and experiment with it. See what kind of tools they provide, what kind of protocols that came up with, right? So experiment inside that space. But then I'm thinking, well, at some point we want to go further here and recognize there are a lot of groups now that utilize, some experiments here and using some of the tool sets we would provide, kind of booting those guys up as fast as we can. But then there's this the bluish thingy, right? The meta body piece that says, well, there's something that goes across all of them, right? There's the bridge that we want to build among them. And if you do this, then of course you need some kind of a structure here too, right? And by structure, I mean not only, the sort of the organizational structure we came up with was saying there are collectives, within collectives are domains, within domains are channels, within channels are circles, and you can go down and down and down. But that's one piece of it. But the other one is, of course, how do you make decisions in this space? If you encounter other groups, right? If you suddenly realize, oh, well, that's not us only, there's a lot of other people involved. Maybe we want to coordinate our efforts here, right? And make some decisions on a higher level together, working on some of the stuff. So that to me is now very interesting to say, okay, maybe there's something that the social ledger can provide in order to, again, provide some scaffolding here to say, hey, there's some governance framework we can provide you that's more based on cooperative game theory than it is on competitive economic models, right? Can we allow some of the ideas to sort of sprout in that meta body space, right? So that everybody can benefit from that. And that to me is a fascinating aspect of the social ledger, if we can get something like this done. Goes back a little bit, we've done some work at the collective, at the Digital Life Collective, right? We created our Sociocratic principles there, which is a pretty cool framework, pretty flexible enough, but things we learned, and Jim, the stuff you learned, and Gary, about sociocracies and governance models in that space certainly would, I think, inform that, for the social ledger, what can be applied on a bigger scale here. I don't know. I'll stop here. I want to hear your opinion here on what it would mean if the meta body suddenly introduces some governance aspects, right? So yes, they all work in their own spaces, and they may have connections between spaces. But what would it mean if you suddenly take a step back and say, hey, you can go further and say, yes, you take advantage of a governance structure that's tied to some kind of a framework, right?
I'll be right back.
Okay. That would suddenly, it's not creating a real organization again, right? I don't want the meta body to be seen as the umbrella organization, right? The new thing that takes care of everybody else, but more as a guiding framework, as a scaffolding for everyone to play in this space here. So I'll stop here and see if you have any thoughts on this.
Yes, one thing about Vlad Zamfir is his take on the governance comes from a view of governing the blockchain behavior. I believe, and hence his examination of the competitive nature of traditional game theory analysis. So he's coming at this from the bottom up in some sense, and others, and I think to look at it from top down sort of switches us into the social choice aspect of this. So I think it's a very natural sort of melding of the two approaches to analysis of governance models.
Mm-hmm. Good. So natural choice, natural extension here. Again, maybe something that others haven't so much considered here because they're very narrow, very specific. You know, as you said in Vlad's context, this is about blockchain technology and how do you govern, you know, this stuff.
Yes, and our approach of looking at these small units that come together to form this larger body, there's sort of an implied governance going on within all of those smaller bodies, and I think maybe a broader view of how we actually go about behaving as a group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, let me write this down. This is good stuff.
I think you have to show the linking. You know, it's the linking that creates the collective intelligence.
Right. You're talking about like sociocratic circles, and then there's some link roles, and then there's a responsibility to
the links
up between up and down. Mm.
The links between them are what coordinates them.
Right.
Essentially, the protocol.
Mm-hmm.
The language defines the relationships.
Yes. Yes. And then the question to me is, how far should we define that language in the social ledger space, right? I mean, we could take things like, you know, we defined 4 roles for the collective, right? The scribe, the guide, the participant, you know, the regular participant, the actor, and the link role, right? Mm-hmm. So we could take this and say, hey, these are standard roles. We find them, you know, helpful in a larger context of, you know, going across these different elements here, kind of standardize some of the things that are happening. And then introduce that here, right, as a way to govern a larger meta body.
Yeah, the way I've been promoting it is, you know, you have the generic roles or the general roles, and then you have the role defined is defined by the activities you're engaged with in the circle. Hmm. You make your own role by engaging in activities, or fill those roles. Standardizing or the taxonomy of those kind of roles is probably something that could be enhanced in the social ledger to steer people into fulfilling the roles that all organizations need.
Yes, that's right, Jim. Right, and it's starting to look at, you know, this group looking at some roles that, you know, maybe we're starting to reach out to, another group here. And since we have now standardized on some of the roles, let's say, and maybe some of the decision-making processes, they can suddenly utilize that, right? So they both have the knowledge of, hey, that's the 4 roles you have, great. That's the decision-making protocol you're using, agree, and then suddenly they're like one unit, you know?
Yeah, wait.
Okay, I went too fast.
I guess it's not roles, really, that we need to define. It's the activities we need to define.
Functions.
Okay.
Okay, so that people can engage, so that people can become engaged in them, defining their role, in the organization based on these functions or activities.
I agree. To me, this is it's a label, right? And you can then define what falls under that label. What kind of activities are just like what we did with saying what a guide typically does, what a scribe typically does, right? So these are the activities that fall under that grouping or heading of, I don't have another word but role for this, right? And you're right. So, because, the moment we pick up the notion of role, that says like, whoa, that's like your thing, your position, right? So coming from an organizational world, you get a position inside a box, right? And that's what you do, and you're not allowed to take any action or leave that box, right, and do something else that's beyond the position description you're operating in, right? But the role, to me, is a lot more fluid, right? That's the thing where you can actually participate in multiple places here, as whoever you are, you know, as whatever talents you bring onto the table.
I guess it's naming a role. I mean, because you know, each person is going to engage in a unique set of activities. And regardless of what you say the role is, it's the set of activities they're involved in, period.
Right. And that's something that needs to go into this protocol to say, okay, these are the typical sets of activities we find, you know, beneficial in that role. If you have that person, it'll be much easier to reach out to another person with that same role and then start this communication, you know, this information exchange. Cool. Okay, let's move on. Already we're too much into this presentation. I wanted to, because it's 12:50 already here in New York. Let me switch to the other deck here. So switching gear towards the architecture side of things, I wanted to show you something I came across, was it yesterday, day before yesterday. Take a look at this. The company called Argo Design, they designed an artificial intelligence interface for a product that some other companies is currently developing, right? Let me make this bigger here. It's all dark and mysterious on their designs. But I really like what I see, and it resonated with some of the aspects of the social ledger. So here is their interface, right? So that this design firm came up with for an artificial intelligence programming environment, call it that way. And it has components, right? So on the left side, you see there are some inputs here, you know, sort of data channels that are coming in, some outputs down here. And then there's some, call it patterns that are invoked. One of the circles says here, insights generator, let's say, right? And then goes to an output, a synapses here on the right side that kind of collects the insights. And it's actually, you know, looks complex and looks complicated, but it's kind of primitive stuff. Simply because what this does is an artificial intelligence tool that grabs a data stream on the left side, right? Let me switch my pointer here. Grabs a data stream here on the left side. You know, could be a text stream, could be a conversation that is happening somewhere in some community, right? Grabs that, throws it into this tool here called Insight Generator, and then comes up with some JSON data to sort of evaluate the data stream. And the typical piece you see here is sentiment analysis. So sentiment analysis just looks at raw data and says, okay, there's between 0 and 1, there's positive or negative sentiment going on in this conversation, and it's based on primitive factors, right? You know, what kind of words are you using, what kind of sentence constellation is in use, frequency of words, and so forth, right? So there are certain indicators that these machine learning algorithms can pick up and then spit out on the other side. Okay, something like a sentiment and indicator is then used as the output, and then you can do something with it, right? So that's the notion of this artificial intelligence user interface here. And there's on the bottom here, I found it interesting, they have this sort of chronological layer of events happening, right? So there's one generator spitting up data that's then picked up by another one and by another one. And there's a timeline here, even, you know, we can zoom in and out and see what happened when and how these systems interacted. So to me, you know, going back to the social ledger, that's an interesting picture to say, hey, there's a lot of parallels here to what we're doing, right? Because we're also looking at these patterns here. We have input streams, we have patterns that we match it with, and we have on the user interface. So what I did here is I took this piece here and then created this slide here to align that a bit more with what the social ledger does. And what you have here on the left side is, these are the data streams, right? The social graph that's coming from some sources, right? So be that, these triangles here, and then hitting some of these hexa thingies, right? Where we kind of combine certain patterns, right? And I labeled them now. I don't know if these are the patterns or not, but to me, these are some sense-making patterns. I wanted to use in this slide. So something John is talking about, for example, the social cognition pattern, social presencing pattern, collective insights pattern. So it's sort of a high-level grouping here. And inside each of these hexagons here is some logic, right? It says, okay, based on these data feeds that are coming into the system, right? And that aggregate some of the data, analyze the data, maybe run some machine learning on top of the data if necessary, right? It comes up with an output, right? And this output now can feed into our interface, the notion of cards, right? So cards with affordances and with actions. So that's what the end user is then, what he or she sees on her screen is some of these cards here, right? Because we said we want to activate some of these patterns. So simple one, let's take a simple one here, the bookmarking piece. Let's say we want to activate a bookmarking piece, which is kind of sharing posts or sharing some knowledge and starting to tag some knowledge. If that's a pattern here, we would have a certain input from certain tools that are coming in. Say, one of the the open source tools is Wallaback, where we have a sort of a browser component, a browser embedded thingy where you can quickly and easily bookmark any relevant article, tag it, and then share that with the rest of the team. So if that's one of the patterns here, we can say, well, there's a related card to that has some logic built into the card, right? Where you can see that maybe a highly relevant article was just posted by someone in the team, right? So keep in mind, this is all happening in a sort of a story context here. So these cards appear, let's say, in your own context of where you work in, right? One example is Basecamp. That to me is one foundational space context for these cards to appear in, right? So let's say Basecamp has a card now for these bookmarks, and we apply some of the logic here that says, okay, Gary found an excellent article on this stuff, right? And it's really highly relevant, big match. I want everybody to read this, right? So what our system would do is say, to sort of highlight that this is the case. That Gary just found an article, he bookmarked it, he put it into the Wallaback database, and there's a ping back into our database that says, hey, new article, and then we run some additional logic that says, hey, this is critical, I want everybody to read it, right? And then on the card interface, right, where we now sit and stay at the screen and say, hey, new card, new link, Gary said something, and then the action would be, read that thing, read that article as soon as possible because it was so relevant to our project, right? So that piece of logic is now built into this system, and it's both human and machine interface, right? So human because Gary found the article, of course. Machine could find it too, but I trust Gary in this respect, right? He finds much better articles than any robot out there. So let's assume he did. He found it, he shared that with the team, right? But then the machine can come in and say, okay, let me go through the text and maybe I can even tag it, right? So add some additional tags to the content, which is a fairly easy task to do today. And then share that with the rest of the team. So it's already prepared and ready to go, for reading this on the team side, right? So for everybody who is part of Basecamp, go in here and say, Gary did this, read that article. And by the way, when you read it, we can also attach, some form of not payment, but points to them. So you read it, you get some points for that, and we recognize that immediately. And by the way, everything is going into what we have at the bottom here, the social ledger, right? Because that piece records that there was an action, there was a card created, there is a new data entry about an article. And we have that available, so we can later see who has taken action on these cards. But so that to me, taking again a step back here is so has so many parallels to the social ledger, and work also I've done in the past with in terms of social cognition and social presencing. If we were to come up with sort of an interface here, and I'm not sure this is an actual interface or if this is an admin interface, I don't know yet. But I do see the parallels here with data that's coming into this activating certain sense-making patterns, right? Which then, the logic that's built into this piece here surfaces in the card-based interface, right? And which triggers then actions on the team side, So here's your affordance, here's your door handle that you can, pull down and then go through the door. Read this stuff, and then there's also a dotted line here going back to the source again, right? So because you took that action, because you read the article, maybe there's additional insights you can provide here. That could be, Michael read the article, says, whoa, amazing, I just read something similar. Let me add that link to the bookmarking thing, right? Or, sorry, or let me add another tag to that. Because that's related to what I what I just saw. So there's a whole feedback loop created in this thing that would be tremendously helpful. Sorry, guys, let me drink. So I'll stop here. Any initial impressions here? What do you see here? Relevant to what we do?
It reminds me of the channels and filters Greg used to talk about in the scenario days. But it's all very cool. I mean, I think this is where it's going, and I don't know exactly how to map this into the social ledger, but it certainly is, it is a map in a sense.
Yes, and I like the modularization of all these little hexagons because I can easily see, I don't know if you want to call them bots or artificial intelligence algorithms that will become quite useful to just drop in the stream of our I'm not sure quite what to call it, but I see my place in this, being over here where all these actions are.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm really resonating with the modularity of all of this. Even just going back to Michael's presentation, John's presentation about the web components. I just love this idea of modularity and bringing in the old Linux philosophy of all the little modules that we used to run at the shell, and the theory behind all that was fantastic, but it was so far ahead of its time. It never got really going, but I see us now as being able to come in now and sort of carry on this sense of designing a stream that we can exist in, and then letting the best tools just be sort of dropped into place to enhance our experience.
I see as this is emerging from, the /dig when we have a pattern on a channel. Okay, we do this query, which will ultimately become more intelligent as we take advantage of the intelligence API out there that we can use to enable the social ledger to act intelligently and sort of get its own higher intelligence.
Right.
I've got to cut out now, gentlemen. But this is really nice. I like the higher intelligence of modularity, collaboration. This is where we're playing. Design is the critical element here, it seems to me, and it's creating the place we want to be going. I'm delighted. There's nothing else I can do except sit on the back of the truck and wave. Hooray! Hooray. Keep it going. But I think this is just firming up so nicely, Joachim. I'm very exciting. Sorry, got to run. Catch you later.
Thanks, Michael.
Bye.
See you
Bye.
later.
Bye, Michael.
Bye-bye.
See you later. Yeah, so this is it's fairly new stuff, and I just read a day or two ago. So I encourage you go back to this slide here. That's in the Social Ledger 2 design deck, right? It's the other deck that we started off with. There's some links at the bottom here. There are two links here. One is to the Argo Design website that explains why they created this kind of interface, and then here's an article on Fast Company that talks about this first claim as a first graphical user interface for artificial intelligence. I don't know about that. But to me, it's a nice way of capturing, some of the things that we're also after, and why not borrowing some of these design aspects and see how we can bring that into the social ledger. Cool. Okay. How are you doing on time? I can go a little bit further. Talk about more about architecture if you're good.
I should be good. I will be listening while I check out a couple of things.
Good. Gary, you too?
Yes, I can continue a while.
Good. Yeah, let's go a little bit into the architecture piece. So one of the things we had talked about was setting up a development environment. And I think that's now becoming more clear after the conversation with John, right? What kind of development environment are we going to building together here, and what kind of web frameworks / this is really now / web components are we using for this technology? So the focus, still for me has been a lot on the interface tech here. So defining this card-based interface. And initially we were thinking about a Firebase database, which actually, it's funny, it's like a circle now. So with Meteor, we would have switched to a Mongo database, which is also a NoSQL database. So same thing essentially. But now with the reappearance of web components, we can decide what that backend actually looks like. Which is great, right? So we have the choice now between, hey, are we going with Mongo database? Fine, let's use that component. Or, are we going with Firebase or the new version of it, which is Firestore? If we think that's a better, solution for this point in time. Or is there a third piece? There's Couch database. There's some other tools that are really, high performance frameworks, databases that I'd be interested to see here too. So it's again a bit of looking now at the different options. Going back to, well, if we don't choose Meteor, then we have to decide what we're going with, right? So it's our choice, which is good from an engineering perspective. It's great because if we don't like it, we use something else later. But we do have to make a decision at some point, fairly soon, to say, hey, it's going to be Mongo, it's going to be Firestore, it's going to be Couch database, it's going to be something else, and then go use that to create our prototype, right? Okay, so that's an update on the architecture slide. Here, I still see this as a valid model to say, hey, we have our sort of actors here that interface with apps. So there's always the notion of the card-based interface, the stuff we're building together, interfacing with apps that are becoming part of the social ledger landscape, right? So apps being, say our starter set is the stuff that we have in Cloudron. So a handful of apps that become available in Cloudron are the apps we want to interface with, right? And each of these apps have their own database backend. We don't have direct access to that, but we have access to an API call, right? So anything that we can now sync between the two, any data we can pull out that's relevant goes into our database here. So this would be the NoSQL database that our interface grabs and surfaces at the front end, right? So difference between front end and the back end here. So this side over here, right, only accessible through their interface and through their database that they're using. We don't have direct access, but we have access through the API. And at that time, I was putting the Lambda thingy there. So like a Lambda function, a very low-level system function that says anything changed in a database, let me grab new records and update our own record. Our own database. But increasingly I see GraphQL playing an important role here, where we define this once in GraphQL and then GraphQL takes care of all of the traffic here, takes care of either polling or takes care of the callback functions to pull the data into our environment, right? So that becomes an increasingly strong data stream between the databases GraphQL would collect with and the data we are capturing here, the metadata again, right? Not all of the data, but the metadata that we use here to feed into the notion of the sense-making patterns, right? So there would be actually, maybe there's a, it's not directly into the card here, but there's something else happening where we sort of analyze that in the middle here, the logical layer. Where we figure out what do we do with the data, what have we learned about the data, and then surface that in the front end, right? So that's an additional piece here that wasn't there when I came up with this diagram. Okay, let me see. The decentralized view here. Let me move on to, or maybe just an update for people.
I would just
yeah.
Mention that the DID directory decentralizes the database. Of course, we need to support the, that's where the service discovery is, and we just need to support those services in order to decentralize.
Yeah.
And basically, we're just doing a query. We're getting back some JSON.
Yes, Jim, and that to me is, let me jump right to this slide here. If we see the social ledger as a fully distributed model, to say, hey, we're tapping directly into some decentralized database backend, right? And if you're saying the authentication piece would already enable that, so because of that database, maybe it's the same database, I don't know yet, right? That would contain the data that we would store it in. Then this becomes a single entity here, right? So a single globally distributed thing where all participants, right? And this is important here. Any actor here, right, that is becoming, part of the social ledger gameplay would utilize the very same distributed database, right?
Yes, it has a distributed identifier, and that's what the standard DID standard is. It's a distributed identifier for any actor in any context.
Right. That to me is like the promised land almost, right? Because then we would sort of push out the social ledger, and anybody who starts using it, is now part of this distributed layer here somewhere, because of the decentralized ID that we create for them, and then also part of the, depending on the context they're working in, right? So their context is somewhere represented in that distributed hash table down here somewhere, right? So that's a very promising aspect. I'm not sure how fast we get there, Jim. That's my question. I don't want an answer now, but if we're saying with the authentication piece, there's already kind of a distributed database in the back end that we utilize, or is an interim step we'll be using something like Firebase as again, centralized approach to storing our data.
There's nothing to prevent. Okay, yes, we couldn't create one DID key value store. Okay, before before we really federate with another one, and yet when we look up a DigLife :DID and discover a service, it could be a sovereign service, or it could be a web ad, an HTTP web service. So so we would do a query on the appropriate DID database using the service that we discovered about it. You know what I mean?
Halfway, Jim. But I try to.
Exactly, clearly, but each different DID type has a service that we use to access objects in that domain that and invoke the services on those objects.
Good.
I'm not sure if we have a DHT on the back here. We have a key value store, not a DH. I guess you could, not a DHT.
Yeah, to me, this is one form of it. There are many, and we couldn't be more generic and say this is just a key value store here, right? Right. But to me, the efficiency comes in from using one of the distributed blockchain technologies, right? So something like Holochain or Archain provides, or is basically, created with distributed hash tables.
Right.
And that's the connection to me here, right? So this eventually, we want to use something like a Archain, right? As our data store, global data store that distributed, every actor is going into the same data store here. That's why the DHT.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, because what we need to build is a key value store on the DHT, and the challenges that presents and the features we need. We need a little bit more than the DHT to do this. But yeah.
Yes.
Well, for some things, a DHT will work just fine. For other things, you'll need an R chain. For some things, a holochain philosophy will work better.
Yes, Gary.
And let me ask one thing.
The other thing we have is, I guess, the other part of it is the incorruptible ledger.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it.
Well,
we're looking at this screen, and we're saying this is our distributed architecture. These are the features that will come into play when we start looking at the social ledger as a distributed.
I think you need to make it plural on the back end for it to be distributed, right?
Yeah, whatever it is.
I see what you're saying. You want a global. You want a global reference. Now you can't have a singular authority. Can't have a single authority. We can have a single authority if we want. but essentially, because the directory is distributed, anyone who stores any subtree of that decentralized directory merely needs to support the API, does not need to use any particular technology.
Right, right, and you don't worry about where it goes anymore. That to me, you're an actor. You work with your own context, create your own, let's say, subtree here, right?
You make your own key value store,
and you put it somewhere in here, right? And you can access it. You secured it. You have your access control over that little subtree here. But it's using, and that to me is a piece that's important. It uses the same technology that allows other subtrees to talk to each other.
There's only a standard interface, a standard API. It doesn't have to use the same technology at all.
No, and I agree, Jim. But for us, it's going to be the question of what technologies that we're going to use first here. What are we going to integrate the social ledger with?
And and I think there's going to be some experimentation in terms of my branch of the DID directory might use one of the graph DBs. I think this is something that will evolve if we're back-end in. We can be back-end agnostic because of the service discovery. Okay, we know essentially we federate with your personal key value store. Because you run the service, you provide the service discovery address for, okay, you have a DID in every context you're in. Okay, so if you're in the context of a channel in the social ledger, you have a DID there, which points to your personal services, whatever they are. Okay, it doesn't have to be in that domain at all, where your persona is. Each persona is a DID, and every context you're in, because, we don't need to get into that now, but as you're exposed in an activity in a in a circle, domain, whatever, determines the what you're going to expose.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to rewind this call a few times to go over what you just said, Jim. Hopefully, I will get. I think I hear you. Loud and clearly. We just take care of this one DID thing, and what do you do with that? As long as you're authenticated, then we don't care. How you go against all of these other data stores.
DID : DIG :
Okay. One more thing I wanted to talk to you about, or just introduce you. This is this piece here. That to me, I can't yet wrap my brain around it. This means, this is where we are now. The social ledger and the code of the social ledger. You have to run it on some machine, some box, right? And we control that code and update it. With the distributed architecture, what you could also do and say, okay, that runs itself, the code itself runs on that network, okay? So it gets pushed out into a decentralized network. So anybody who utilizes it can get it from here. Very similar to an app store. Think a mobile phone app store. You click on that thing and you download your app. In this case, you would download the Social Ledger app and you run it on whatever environment you want to, right? And then it connects also again to whatever key value story you're utilizing here, right? But that concept to me, and I think the Holochain guys are talking a lot about this, that to me is still quite foreign. I have to wrap my head around it, going from here to something like this here. Well, the code is out there too, right?
Yeah, well, with a DApp, I mean, the main thing is there's some shared state of the system, okay, that is exchanged, okay? I suggest that what we exchange, that's exchange is enabled by the DID directory, okay? And that this is simply an app that runs the ability to deploy an app running with a particular identity in a particular context. Okay, I almost look at it as the bot store. I mean, you're hey, I want to use ledger.php. Click a button, okay, or /dig. I want to use, I mean, right now with centralized /dig ID, that could just be /ID. That could be a separate component. It could be included in the /dig package, right? Couldn't.
So, Joachim, you're saying that our slash code goes over on the actor side now, but it will move, eventually we want to move it to the DApp side. If you look at the platform we're on now, which is Mattermost, as the DApp, does that sort of unify this thinking a bit?
No, not Mattermost, but if you think in terms of, let's say, a Holochain, right? If we decide to run the social ledger on top of Holochain, so we would essentially write a distributed app using Holochain technology. So that would mean that's the app that runs what you use inside the whatever Holochain infrastructure they come up with. If you go to their website, right, to their Mattermost channels, you'll see that Anders has broken up the Holochain website into all these channels on Mattermost, where they talk about apps, ideas for apps, right? Governance apps, chat apps, categorization apps, all kinds of apps that they're wanting to create on top of the Holochain infrastructure, right? So that to me would be another instance of the social ledger now saying, hey, we're running on the Holochain network. So if you participate in that network, you have easy access, easy discovery, because we're part of a store or whatever they create. You can download it and run it in your game, right? And you run it. That to me is let me show you another slide here, Gary, and then maybe that's more helpful, because I was thinking through what can we do today actually to have a similar distributed app, based on CloudJohn. Let me show you this, and Jim, that might be interesting for you to see. This says Meteor, right? So don't look at this Meteor stack here. That's currently under revision, right? But there are two blocks on this graph here, on this diagram. Let me make this bigger. Okay, the block on the left is what I call build it, right? So that's the stack we're putting together now to build the social ledger application, right? So whether or not it's Meteor or not is not relevant, but there's a stack here, right? There's a UI component, there's app logic, there's a templating engine, there's the client side, the server side, there's microservices, and there are the data sources, right? So this is all relevant, and we're going to build and use one of these stacks for the social ledger. But here, the new thing here, Jim, Gary, on the right side is what I call ship it. So here's build it and here's ship it. So here's the notion of, okay, here's CloudRun, right? So the blue thing is the container, right? That says a series of applications now inside this container that we integrate the social ledger with, right? One of them is Mattermost, but there's others like Wallaback, like Kanban, like Memo, and more, right? So the applications inside the CloudRun infrastructure. And then here's the kicker. There's also one that is the social ledger, okay? We can actually add the social ledger to the CloudRun infrastructure to say, hey, that's the place where you go and find it, and then download the whole package. Actually, you can download the entire package here, and then we can ship it out, and other people could use it. The notion being here, Jim, is if we submit it to something like a CloudRun app store, right? We could disseminate that social ledger much faster on a larger scale.
Yes, and I think we also want to be able to launch, HIE of one or Solid or Glue, so identity providers, so that they can, you can have a single sign-on that works. And then, the issue is federating. In other words, how do I, this new community with its own social ledger, now we want to give their social ledger permissions to access our social ledger.
Right.
Okay. And so we're going to expose our key value store to them. Okay. Through an API that exposes what they should see. Or, depending on their identity, if the user, so to speak, is in both communities, it uses their permissions as a member of both.
Right. Yeah, I think I'm starting to get it, Jim. That makes a lot of sense. So going back to our initial release, right, of the social ledger prototype, the 2.0 prototype. So we're setting up two environments now, right? One, which you've already done, Jim, is the media environment, which we may have to take down. So sorry for this if we go with a component-based architecture. But this is the development environment, right? Versus this other environment that we haven't set up yet, and there's no real rush here, right? But it's the CloudRun piece. So to pick some initial applications we want to actually integrate the social ledger with, right? So again, the API calls into Mattermost, into Wallaback, into Kanban, into Memo, or something like that, to pull metadata out of these tools into the card-based user interface, right? And that, so we sort of in the initial version we own that box here, the blue box, right? It's going to run on our wherever it is, DigitalOcean slice, and we'll run it as long as we can scale it, and as we can, as people willing, people to actually maybe pay some of the services that we offer to them, right? But then we can say, we package that, and then we get to the next level, Jim, that you mentioned, right? They can take the whole cloud infrastructure, install it on their own environment, and sort of replicate that whole thing for themselves, right? Now it's theirs, and they can do whatever they want to do. They stay up to date because they can have that same neat little update button, right, in CloudRun, where say new social ledger comes out. Well, click that button, update social ledger, done, right? And you have the new features right there inside your own CloudRun environment, right? That runs on whatever box you decide to run it on, right? So that is an important piece to me to bring it to the next level, right? So instantiate the whole CloudRun piece into another one. And the other thing I wanted to mention here, Gary and Jim, is you see this gray box here. It says Subotai. So eventually, if Subotai decides either to include a cloud on infrastructure into their environment, which I doubt. I don't think they're going to go that route. But since both of them are based on these Docker containers, right? So Cloud On is based on Docker containers. Subutai is based on Docker containers, right? I don't see.
No, it isn't.
Say again, it's not? Subutai is not based on Docker?
No, they're using ELF containers.
Okay.
They're a little lighter than Docker, but what they did promise early this year that they would support Docker images, which would be a major step in my view, since the standard has become Docker. Since they been around.
I see. Excellent news. Okay, thanks, Jim, for the update here. So not on Docker, but eventually they're going that direction, which to me is cool because then that opens a pathway to say, hey, that thing can also run on a Subutai infrastructure, right? And what that means is that now distributes the load towards any server that people want to utilize, right? They want to use their own box, use it, right? If there's a cheap, third party that's part of the Subutai network, use that, right? If there's a community that runs their own box, their own server, well, that's the box they're going to use and run our stuff on top of that, right? So to me, this goes very much into this permaculture, living systems thinking of, you want to be sustainable, you want to create some anti-fragile environment for yourself that is not dependent on any big players out there, or where they end up paying large server fees because they have so many members, right? So that gets to sort of support that notion of they can sustain, they can help themselves and create this thing. And we just, on our end, we're just swapping out the underlying infrastructure layer with something else. So Gary, going back to your point, the question you had, that code, does it run on some other box, right? So in this scenario here, I can see our code running on Cloud Run. There are ways to upload your own application, and there are ways to actually submit that. And then there's some approval process, obviously, on their end to say, hey, yes, okay, that can run on their infrastructure and then become part of their store, right, as a distribution mechanism. So that to me is a promising path without exploring or really waiting for what Holochain comes up with, to make their development environment more stable and robust and easy to use, right? So that you can create other applications that run on their box, right? And then gets into their environment and their user base. Okay, enough mind-boggling stuff for today. Let me stop sharing here. A lot to catch up. Thank you for stopping by, Gary. Thank you, Jim. Yes, you mean it?
Thank you.
Yeah, I got my homework. I have to revisit GraphQL. Okay, see how that works, how that plays with REST and the rest of the API infrastructure there. It seems like we can have a gateway there, and that it's a perfect abstraction, I hope, for our decentralized identifiers, okay, which identify all our social objects and all our persona in all our contexts.
Okay. Good. Yes, you have homework. I start with the video, Jim, right? I think that's a good one because I want to know how to move fast on John's notion of using web components as opposed to a framework like Media. But then all of the other good stuff when you have time. And you too, Gary. Lots of stuff to think about, to write about, right? And
C4 model?
Sorry?
That the C4 model, or is that something else?
You talk about the video?
Yeah.
Let me go there real quick.
I can just look where it takes me.
Yeah, let me. That's a no. If
That's Simon Brownling.
Here is there's some links. There's the stuff around the Argo design stuff. But if you go up here, past the lightning talks, You can watch your social ledger talk again. Thanks, Jim, for sharing that. That was cool. Suddenly, this stuff popped up in the conference. But here, it says use the platform, Luke. You see that? That was one of John's slides.
Oh, and this,
Right. So that's the SL Dev environment part 2 conversation. That's where John,
way back there,
way back, yeah.
way back.
Things are running fast.
I am just so far behind and everything. That's like the social ledger environment part 2.
Yes. All right, let you go. Thanks, guys. Another
Awesome.
conversation, another time.
Yeah.
Keep up the good work.